Let's read the text for our message together from James chapter 1. This morning, James chapter 1, we're going to read verses 2 through 4. The title of the message today is Facing Life's Testing Times. James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." One thing is certain about life: there will be testing times. And so the question we ought to be asking is not if there will be trials in our lives or even when they are going to come, but rather how we're going to deal with them when they do come. Because the trials of life will either conquer us or we will conquer them. And James gives us some instructions this morning in the text on how to face life's testing times. Look at what he says right off the bat in verse 2. He says, "Count it joy when you meet trials of various kinds." One of the things James is teaching us is that trials definitely come in life. He doesn't say if the trials come, but he says when they come. There is an increasingly popular theology, I notice in a lot of churches today, where people are teaching that if you just have the right attitude about life, if you have a positive mind, or if you just have enough faith, that you are never going to go through trials in life. That God wants us all to be healthy and happy and rich all of our lives, and you can be that way if you just have the right frame of mind. And that is unscriptural nonsense. Trials come to all of us, and James teaches us that right in the very first words of our text. But then he also teaches us not only that trials definitely come, but that they come at indefinite times. He says this in a way that indicates the indefinite nature of the trials, when they come. I looked this word up, by the way, in the original language, and this word for trials, we have an English word that comes from this word, and you'll never believe what it is. We get our English word pirate from this word. Now, what are pirates? They're out there somewhere, right? You don't know where they are. They're hidden. They pounce on the unsuspecting when they least expect it. That's what pirates do. And that's the word that James uses here to describe the trials of life. We don't know when the trials are going to come. We just have to be ready for them. You might remember back in your school days, maybe you had a teacher who gave pop quizzes. You remember those? Those are those unannounced tests where they just, you show up for class one day and the teacher says, "We have a pop quiz." Well, that's what the trials of life are like. It's the phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning, or the sound of screeching brakes, the unexpected news, like pirates. So trials definitely come, but they come at indefinite times. And then he tells us also in verse 2 that the trials are of various types. Look at what he says. When you meet trials of various kinds, one translation has it, the word that is translated various is literally multicolored. It's the exact same word that's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament for Joseph's coat of many colors. You remember that? That's what James says the trials of life are like. They are multicolored. In other words, some are physical, some are emotional, some are spiritual, some are financial. Some come upon us suddenly, others come gradually. And the tests of life are not the same for every person. God has trials and tests to match each one of us. Every test that you get, not only is God's thumbprint on that test, but so is yours. It's designed especially for you. Only Abraham, for example, was asked to offer his only son. Moses wasn't, neither was Jacob or Joseph. Jesus asked only the rich young ruler to sell everything he had. He didn't ask that of Nicodemus, for example. Your test may not be his test, but all tests are designed specifically for us. And I've noticed something I think we're all prone to do. We are prone to criticize those brothers and sisters who fail tests that we would never fail, not realizing that we fail tests they would never fail. One brother may hold up well under a test that would crush you, and you may hold up well under a test that would crush him. One may fail a moral test. Another may fail a test of greed, or hubris, or arrogance. Still others may fail a test of covetousness. So we should never compare tests or be overly proud because I passed the test that he failed. Because you never know how he did with the test that may be a trifle to you and a fiery trial to him, but maybe the trifle to him is your fiery trial. The test that shakes one person's life to the very foundation may not even faze someone else. And so the trials that come definitely but at indefinitely times are varied in nature. But then look at what he says in verse 2, and this is an incredible statement. He says, you can consider it pure joy when the trials come. Now, James is not a masochist. He's not saying that trials are fun or enjoyable. We don't frolic our way to a funeral. We're not giddy on our way to the hospital. We don't laugh when our bank accounts are being drained down to zero. When we moved back from Argentina, because one of our children was sick, we were in really good financial shape at the time. We had no bills. We paid off all our bills. We didn't owe a penny to anybody. And we had a pretty good amount of money in the bank. We came back trying to sense where God was leading us now. Where were we going to go here in the U.S.? Some jobs came open, some ministries, but none that we really felt the Lord's leadership in. And long story short, we ended up unemployed for about 10 months. And all the money in our bank account just kept going down, 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 until it got down to zero. And then we started living on credit cards to just make ends meet until God opened up the door and we ended up here in California. I wasn't laughing during that time, let me tell you. James is saying here that our joy can be constant in spite of the trials we face. And he's talking about real joy here, not a superficial putting a smile on your face or burying your head in the sand. He calls it pure joy or all joy. It's literally undiluted joy, that sense of deep inner well-being that nothing can shake. And he tells us in verse 2 to consider it joy, or to reckon it joy, as if it's something we do by mental discipline or spiritual willpower. I've noticed over the course of my life that most people, when they meet tests, they meet it in one of three ways, at least in a negative sense. They meet tests with resentment. God allows tests to come into your life and you resent God for it, for allowing this trial to come into your life, and you become bitter and cynical. Or they meet it with retaliation. They want to get even with somebody because of what they're suffering. Or they meet it with resignation. They just give up. They're burnt out on life, overrun by life. James says that the Christian's attitude when trials come into your life is to be pure, unadulterated, undiluted joy. Not resentment, not retaliation, not resignation, but rather an undiluted inner sense of well-being. He uses that word in verse 2 that he says we fall into trials. That's the very same word that Jesus uses in Luke chapter 10 when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan and that man who falls among thieves. It is the idea that trials pounce on us unexpectedly. And so James is saying, when he tells us to consider it or to reckon it, he's saying you'd better have your attitude fixed before you fall into the trial. It's too late when you're out in the storm to find out if your boat is seaworthy or not. You better know that before the storms are coming. That's what James is saying here. Before you fall into the trial, consider it, reckon it pure joy. And then the last thing, look, it's in verse 2 and then again in verse 4. He tells us fiery trials are sent to us to produce in us a stronger faith. You see, here is the rationale for why we can react to trials with joy. It is the understanding that God has a purpose in them. He's saying that we can have joy in spite of the trials of life when we know that God has a purpose in them. And he tells us that the purpose is to produce. It's translated different ways. Some translations say patience, that's what the King James says. But it's more than just patience. Some translations say perseverance or endurance or steadfastness. I like all of those translations. It is to bring out a complete, mature faith. That's the idea. Somebody said, Satan tempts us to bring out our worst. God tests us to bring out our best. And that's what James is saying here. That the trials of life are the gymnasium where your spiritual muscles are developed. And when you develop a genuine, real, mature faith, it is a faith that will sustain you to the very end, no matter how difficult the trials are. If I build a bridge over water that's, say, 220 feet, but the water is 250 feet, the bridge I build may be an engineering marvel, but it's of absolutely no use to me because it's not enough to go to the end of the water. You will never know how genuine your faith is until you go through trials. Somebody said Christians are like tea bags. You never know what's in them until you put them in hot water. You'll never know how genuine your faith is until you go through a trial. You want to see the difference between a genuine Christian and somebody who just professes Christianity? You watch them when they're undergoing the trials of life. A lot of people have great confidence in their faith until they're severely tested. And then the faith goes away. You will never know your motives for worshiping God, for being a Christian, until your faith is tried. You remember that Satan told God, the only reason Job worships you is because you blessed him with good health and wealth, all the material possessions of life. He has a great family. You let me touch him, and he will curse you. And God allowed it. And Job lost his health. He lost his wealth. He even lost his family. And you want to know when Job knew his faith was genuine? It's when he sat on the ash heap of his life and worshiped God. You'll never know how genuine your faith is. You'll never know what your motives for your faith are until you've been tested. You will never know what you claim to believe theologically is true or not until you've been tested. It's one thing to say, I believe in the sovereignty of God, and I believe in the revelation of Scripture, and I believe in the resurrection of the dead. It's another thing to go through the trials of life and to have those beliefs tested. It's one thing to say, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. It is another thing to stand over the grave of a loved one and to look down into that grave and to have that belief as the bedrock of your life. It's when you go through tests that you find out if you have the kind of faith that will sustain you or desert you when times get hard. James says that perseverance must finish its work in verse 4. It must finish its work so that you may be complete, not lacking anything. What he's saying here is very practical. He's saying this maturity that God is trying to work in you, it will govern every aspect of your life. Do you have an unreasonable employer or a boss who just makes your life miserable? That can make you bitter and cynical, or you can see it as a divine appointment that God is trying to use to develop a Christ-like temperament and spirit in you. Do you have monotonous work to do? You can let that make you resentful, or you can do what Paul suggested and do your work as unto the Lord and bring the very Spirit of Christ into the place where you work. Have you done your very best in life and yet someone has wronged you? Nothing produces a spirit of resentment more than that. But you can also hear the words of Jesus who said, "Rejoice and leap for joy when men spitefully use you, for great is your reward in heaven." Have you suffered sudden financial loss? You can allow that to become an occasion for bitterness in your life, or you can allow God to teach you to hold lightly onto the things of the world, because all of them are temporary and passing, and let God use it as a reminder to you that only those things that He gives you can never be taken from you. You see, the goal in the trials of life, James tells us, is full Christian maturity that cannot be faked. My dad worked his entire life outdoors. I'm talking about from boyhood on. He worked out in the sun, the wind, the rain, and when you saw his skin, you knew he had spent a lifetime. He was about as dark as a man can get. He spent 86 years out in the sun and the wind and the rain. You can't look like he looked sitting in a tanning bed. It was just a lifetime of being outdoors, and it showed on every square inch of his skin. The Christian faith is like that. Trials produce in us a faith that is genuine, a godly countenance that cannot be faked. And that's the goal of the trials. It's not persistence that's the goal. James says that the trials produce persistence, but persistence isn't the goal. I've known Christians in my lifetime who've been persistent. They're persistently miserable. They're persistently complaining. They're persistently discouraged. They're persistently defeated. Persistence isn't the goal. Christ-likeness is the goal. God is sending the trials of life into our lives so that He might work in us a full, mature, Christ-like spirit. There's a group of women who decided they would meet for Bible study. And each week they read different books of the Bible. They were reading through them. And one particular week they began a study in the book of Malachi. And they came to chapter 3, verse 3 of Malachi, which reads, it says of God that He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. The women were stumped. They had no idea. What does that say about the nature and character of God? He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. And so one of them agreed that before they met again the next week, she would make an appointment with the silversmith to go watch him work and observe what he does and see if she could gain some insight that she could come back and share with the group. And so she did that. There was a local silversmith, and she made an appointment to go watch him work. She didn't tell him why. She didn't tell him anything about the Bible study group. She just said, I'd like to come watch you work and learn something about the refinement of silver. And so she went. And she watched as the silversmith held a piece of silver over the fire and let it heat up. And he explained to her that as he refined the silver, that he had to hold the silver into the very center of the fire where the flames were the hottest in order to burn away all of the impurities. The woman thought about that as he was saying it, about how God holds us sometimes in those hot spots of life. And she thought about that verse that God sits as a refiner and purifier of silver. And she asked the silversmith if it was true that he had to sit there the whole time while the silver was being purified. And he said yes, and not only was that true, but that he had to watch the silver very carefully, because if it was left in the fire for even a moment too long, the silver would be ruined. And then the woman asked the silversmith, well then, how do you know when the silver has been fully refined? It's so simple, that's easy. I know it's fully refined when I can see my image in it. That's where God is going. With those fiery trials that he sends into your life, he wants to get you and me to the place where he sees his image in us. That's the goal. And so, brothers and sisters, when trials come into your life, rejoice and consider it pure joy, because you know now where God is going with those trials. We're going to sing this morning as our song of invitation the first and last stanzas of Shall We Gather at the River, hymn number 5.